Thank you all for being here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jess Ross. I'm the new Adult Services Director here at Durham Public Library, and we're so glad that you could join us to hear Michael speak tonight. But without further ado, we would like to welcome Michael Behrendt. Michael is the town planner for Durham and a longtime fan of Frank Lloyd Wright. He gave a presentation recently to the docents of Wright's Zimmerman House at the Currier Museum in Manchester about Frank Lloyd Wright and the Transect, which is a planning tool used in new urbanism. Michael has given presentations at the Durham Public Library about the architecture of Durham and his trips to Belgium, Holland, Ireland, the Southwest, and the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. So without further ado, welcome Michael, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jess. Welcome. Thank you for joining me this evening to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright, America's greatest architect. And I missed the sesquicentennial of his birth last year, so we are here for his palindrome birthday, his 151st this Friday. Please save questions and comments for the end. But I hope you'll have a lot of questions and comments, and that you feel free if you want to argue with me at the end. And I have not persuaded you that he's America's greatest architect. I would certainly welcome your rebutting that, if you're inclined. This is the Roby House in Chicago. What is this building? Where did this come from? And what's with the cantilevers? You all know what cantilevers are, right? Yeah. So a cantilever is something that projects. A cantilever is something that, like a roof that projects over, that's unsupported at the end. There were no precedents for this kind of building when Wright designed it in 1908. There's an architect. Walter Wright's the greatest architect of all time, with some exceptions. So when there were no precedents for this kind of building when Wright designed it in 1908, other than similar structures that he had done. And it still looks modern and dramatic 110 years later. These were the other houses of the time. You might not be able to see them. Colonial revivals, bungalows, Tudors, four squares. And we'll return to the Roby House later. And as Jess mentioned, my interest in Frank Lloyd Wright blossomed during a visit to Oak Park, Chicago, a leafy turn-of-the-century suburb where he lived and designed many houses. His early ones, rendered in late Victorian styles, blend in. But then something starts to happen. The houses stretch out, pushing their elbows out this way and that, struggling to emerge. He was in his early 20s when he started. And then finally they burst forth in full expression in defiance of everything around them. So these are just some of his houses throughout his career. Frank Lloyd Wright was a revolutionary and a great genius. He would be the first to inform you of that. His life was epic, comprising tectonic changes in American society. As Ken Burns said in his wonderful profile on Wright, he was born 2 years after Appomattox and died 2 years after Sputnik. Oops. His career spanned 70 years, and he was productive right until his death at age 91. He designed more than 1,000 structures, of which 532 were built. Wright believed that a building should be a work of art, and he choreographed his structures as stage sets for graceful and humane daily living. He sought to create a complete environment, integrating the various components of the building and the site, all of which he designed: furniture, fixtures, furnishings and carpets, art glass windows, landscaping, even dishes for the Imperial Hotel, and a dress for Darwin Martin's wife to complement the decor. He designed mostly single-family houses, but also churches, schools, hotels, office buildings, stores, theaters, and a museum. And the extraordinary thing is that each creation was unique, most were beautiful, and many are masterpieces. Before Wright, a typical house resembled a box with doors and windows punched into it, and it was divided into smaller boxes on the inside. Wright dedicated himself to breaking the box with what he called organic architecture. Many architects start the design process with the outside volume, and then they fit the floor plans within, which is actually not a bad way to design, especially in an urban environment where you want to fit within context. But Wright designed from the inside out, with open flowing spaces through the house and leading to the exterior. He drew upon the quotation from Lao Tzu that the reality of the cup is not the cup itself, but the space contained by the cup. Walls, if you look at these, walls, floors, ceilings, the junctures between them, and space are all manipulated in new ways to create surprise and delight. And Wright chose these wonderful autumnal hues, rich browns, golds, greens, and reds. Almost always there was a large hearth at the center as a focal point and gathering place for the family. And Wright was an extraordinary engineer, cleverly integrating different elements of a structure to serve multiple purposes. Biographer Robert Twomley said of one house, "Eaves, window seats, lights, wainscoting, glazing, water pipes, and vents all combine in various ways to provide warmth, cooling, view, shade, air circulation, seating, and privacy." And that's organic architecture. Who would have the chutzpah to design a building like this in the middle of his own town? When the earlier structure burned down, the pastor had hoped for a New England-style meeting house. And that's not what he got. It helped that Wright was a Unitarian and he was a member of Unity Temple. Ken Burns said, "The exterior of his Unity Temple was unlike any other church anywhere. Some disappointed worshipers compared it to a prison gatehouse, an ice cream factory, a Mayan handball court. But the interior was something else again." This is very hard to say what's your favorite Wright building, and there's many more to see, but this is it. Especially the contrast, the surprise from the outside to come into this space, which of course a photograph cannot capture. Wright called Unity Temple his little jewel box. As brilliant as Wright was, he was equally difficult. He had a short temper and a tremendous ego. He was a world-class narcissist and self-promoter. He said, "Early in my career, I had to choose between an honest arrogance and a hypocritical humility. I deliberately chose an honest arrogance, and I've never been sorry." Wright believed that his clients were lucky to have a building by him, and he relished insulting them if they departed from his wishes. He returned to homes that he had designed and rearranged the furniture if it was not to his liking. Biographer Brendan Gill said, "To the owners of these houses, Wright still, long after his death, exists as a sort of invisible resident despot whose disapproval they dread incurring. Even the slightest changes in the layout or appearance of a Wright house are undertaken with fear and trembling." Biographer Ada Louise Huxtable said, "He led a shockingly unconventional life. He was considered morally and fiscally irresponsible, a view he encouraged with illicit romantic liaisons and perpetually unpaid bills. He made whatever promises and accommodations were necessary as the occasion and his art required. Shame was not an emotion he entertained." If you read about Frank Lloyd Wright, that is defining character. He never felt any shame. He could charm endless advances out of clients' pockets, writing marvelously witty and wheedling letters while buildings went over budget and out of control. Yet, as one of his draftsmen said, he was 200% alive. No artist ever pursued his muse more tenaciously. Wright led a colorful and tempestuous life with numerous well-publicized scandals. He was married 3 times, and he was a victim of unimaginable tragedy. But he was a survivor having brilliant second, third, and fourth acts. So, Frank Lloyd Wright was born June 8th, 1867, in the small rural town of Richland Center, Wisconsin. He spent the summers of his youth working on his uncle's farm near Spring Green, Wisconsin, where his mother's clan lived, 30 miles west of Madison. Frank's mother, Anna, was part of a large, well-known family of Welsh Unitarians. The motto of the Lloyd Jones clan, one frequently invoked by Frank Lloyd Wright throughout his career, was truth against the world. Anne Wright decided early on that her son would grow up to be a great architect. Frank's father, William Carey Wright, was a talented orator, music teacher, politician, and Baptist minister. But he did not stay long anywhere, continually moving his family when jobs did not work out. And his father, I think, was and it's always a fascinating question, where does genius come from? And where did this genius come from? And you're born with it. But also, you look at the parents and say, what did he get from his father? I think his father was a brilliant, very creative person, but he was a failure, sadly, in his life. He would travel from one town to another. People would welcome him. He would be the minister. He would be a musician. And he would become a leader of the community. And then for some reason, everything would fall apart in 6 months. And he would move again. It was very sad. The Wrights separated when Frank was 14, and they divorced 4 years later. William Wright then vanished from the scene, and Frank never saw him again from the time he was 18 on. But he clearly inherited certain traits: love of music, restlessness, great charm, and the inability to live within his means. After dropping out of high school, Wright enrolled at the University of Wisconsin at Madison as a special student. He took engineering classes but left after a few terms, preferring education in the real world, though he did receive an honorary degree from Madison almost 70 years later. In 1887, 20-year-old Frank Lloyd Wright, a high school dropout, college dropout, headed to Chicago, 22, determined to become an architect. And his timing was propitious. The Great Fire of 1871, 16 years earlier, and growth in the Midwest created opportunities in Chicago and in the burgeoning suburbs located along new commuter rail lines. After a stint with architect Joseph Silsby, Wright had the chutzpah to apply to Chicago's greatest architectural firm, along with Daniel Burnham, was the firm of Adler and Sullivan. Has anyone heard of Louis Sullivan, the architect? So he applied to the prestigious firm of Adler and Sullivan, where he worked for 5 years. And this is Louis Sullivan's wonderful Wainwright building in St. Louis. And Wright formed a special bond with Louis Sullivan, who was a loner and a brooding genius. The portrait on the left is from 1895. Sullivan and Wright thought they would change the world together. Sullivan was the only architect for whom Wright ever expressed admiration, referring to him always as Lieber Meister, German for beloved master. And Wright became adept at imitating Sullivan's floral arabesques, and with most uncharacteristic modesty. Wright called himself a good pencil in the master's hand. Never hear him use that kind of language later on. So his family, in 1889, just before his 22nd birthday, Wright married Catherine Tobin, or Kitty, the daughter of a wealthy businessman. And remember, he was really a farm boy. He was from the country and moved to Chicago, and he's very naive. And he had no experience with girls before that. So it is said he married the first pretty girl that he met in Chicago, who evidently was a lovely person. And then with a loan from Louis Sullivan, he bought a plot of land in Oak Park, a prosperous but conservative town where the saloons stop and the steeples begin. He built a house and studio there, and his family quickly grew to include 6 children. The photograph on the left is from 1890, and Frank is on the right with his adoring sister, Maginelle, Kitty's in the middle, holding their first son, Lloyd. Wright's mother's behind Kitty. And then the others are his sister, cousin, aunt, and his uncle Jenkin, who was quite a renowned preacher. Wright was not much of a father, but he built this wonderful playroom for his children. And then in the latter picture, you can see, with most of his family, that he's conspicuously sitting separate from his family. Wright was well paid at Sullivan and Adler, but he was always short of funds due to his profligacy. He famously said, "Give me the luxuries of life, and I will gladly do without the necessities." His contract prohibited him from taking extra work, but he designed at least 9 houses on the sly, which he called his bootleg houses. And his early houses were rendered in the styles of the day. He was 20. He was young. He hadn't yet evolved his style, and he, of course, didn't have the confidence to tell a client, "I'm going to do it my way." If a client wanted colonial revival, that's what he was going to design. But there are hints of Wrightian features to come in the Thomas and Walter Gale houses at the top. A strong overhang of the eaves, ribbon windows, terraces, and these wonderful steps spilling out on both sides. The George Blossom house has an elegant and innate elegance in the colonial revival style. But Wright never again designed in this style. He decried traditional styles. He thought they were, out of date and inappropriate. But he clearly understood what he was rejecting. So when Louis Sullivan learned about Wright's moonlighting, he felt betrayed, and he fired Wright. Although in Wright's autobiography, he tells a different story, that he quit, but he was fired. His whole life is just full of, he was a brilliant architect, and he never compromised in his buildings. But he was a first-class bullshitter. He was endlessly entertaining and shameless. But Sullivan fired him, which was really tragic because the two of them were very close. And they were estranged for 17 years. And this is the way Wright was. I mean, his father left. He refused to have anything to do with him. He had loved Sullivan. They had this falling out, which was Wright's fault. And they were estranged for 17 years. Just very, very sad. And when they finally reconciled, Louis Sullivan was a broken alcoholic. Louis Sullivan, one of America's greatest architects, died in near poverty and obscurity. And when they reconciled, Wright last saw him, he was in a hotel room. He was a broken down alcoholic near death. And they shared some moments in Sullivan's, it was like a flop house. Wright wrote in an obituary of Sullivan, "To know him well was to love him well. I never liked the name Frank until I would hear him say it, and the quiet breath he gave it made it beautiful in my ears. The deep quiet of his temper had great charm for me." Sullivan was less active after the breakup of his firm, which was only 2 years after Wright left, and he considered himself a failure. But he did go on to design these wonderful small bank buildings throughout the Midwest. So Wright started his own private practice in 1893. The eccentric but handsome Winslow House was his first independent commission. And this was the last time that he ever used double-hung windows, which he called guillotine windows. Double-hung windows are vertical. Choosing instead the more graceful French windows. And Wright this is all part of organic. And I just want to make this an analogy. Wright, so the rest of his life he used French windows, which were casement windows that opened out. And I think there's an analogy, and I'm going off on a limb here, but in Tai Chi, for instance, they speak of the Chi at your center, and everything comes from your center. Just like Wright's architecture the energy, the source came from your center in the heart. And in Tai Chi, you move from your center, and that energy goes out into your arms. And I think there's that same kind of energy in his design, his organic architecture, and why he liked French windows. And everything he did, I mean, he was just absolutely brilliant. He wrote many, many books and countless articles, and he spoke. He was remarkably prolific, and yet, as an architect, and he was always speaking and writing and sharing new ideas, and he was getting arrested, and he was in exile, and he was having terror. I mean, how did this person have the time to do this work? It's just extraordinary. Let's see. Oh, so the floral images on the front door and in the porte cochere are very Sullivan-esque, because he had just left Sullivan. But his references to nature later became much more abstract. This is the interior. Wright later decried the classical columns and pilasters and arches that he had used generously in his early buildings. So he rejected all of this traditional historical architecture. But obviously, he knew what he was doing. I mean, it's absolutely elegant. Horizontality is emphasized in the Hertley House with the concrete base, which marries the building to the ground but also elevates it, the ribbon windows, the alternating rows of flush and protruding bricks and contrasting orange and rose colors. These narrow bricks are called Roman bricks. And the way that he emphasized horizontality, no one's ever done this that I know of, it's just brilliant. He wanted to emphasize the horizontality of the building. So he uses these long, narrow bricks. The vertical joints are almost invisible. The mortar is the same color as the bricks, so the vertical joints disappear. The horizontal joints are deeply raked, so the horizontality is emphasized. And just brilliant, and also beautiful. And there's also a nice contrast to the horizontality with the vertical piers. The prominent circular entry, which is evocative of Louis Sullivan and also Henry Hobson Richardson, and the angular prow. And Wright found it difficult to resist adding urns. He was known for his urns as well as his cantilevers. And other architects followed suit, leading to an epidemic of urns throughout the Midwest. His practice boomed between 1900 and 1909. He designed 135 houses, mostly in the new suburbs around Chicago. Ada Louise Huxtable said, his clients were successful, well-educated businessmen, leaders in the community who could afford a substantial home. Wright's work, representing an advanced view of architecture, intrigued them. It also appealed to their aesthetically and intellectually involved wives. Their homes were brave gestures of informed patronage in what Wright habitually scorned as a surrounding sea of suburban bourgeois Philistinism. So he was great and all the other architects were awful. The Ward Willets House. Can you read the small gray stuff? This is Highland Park, 1901. Can you read that? Wright's early work culminated finally in the prairie style, evoking the region's flat and rolling grassland. He said, "We of the Middle West are living on the prairie. The prairie has a beauty of its own, and we should recognize and accentuate this natural beauty. Its quiet level, hence gently sloping roofs, low proportions, quiet skylines, suppressed heavyset chimneys, and sheltering overhangs, low terraces, and outreaching walls sequestering private gardens." The Ward Willets House is considered his first full prairie house. The house is integrated with a site through the emphatic horizontal lines, and it's beautifully proportioned and balanced with a nice contrast of light stucco and dark wood trim. I mean, isn't that beautiful? Or not? Anyone not like it? Back to the Roby House. Ironically, the Roby House in Chicago is the most iconic, it's probably his greatest prairie house. But it occupies a narrow strip of land in one of the country's largest cities, ironically. But Wright is certainly breaking the box here. Bruce Pfeiffer described the house as strong, sculptural, and dynamic, with its sweep of lines and abstract composition of masses, but at the same time sheltering and protective. Perhaps the most distinct feature of Wright's architect to the layperson is the cantilevers, which might seem a bit of an affectation. And you see them even more in the earlier shot that I had. But they serve to emphasize the horizontality, and they also link the interior with the exterior with this intriguing kind of ambiguity. If I'm standing here, I'm kind of partly inside, partly outside. It's part of the organic, movement of the joining of interior and exterior. They create interest and drama, and they show off the technology that makes them possible. Strangely, this is the living room. The entrance to this house, like a number of other Wright properties, is hidden on the back side. You had to work to get into a Wright house. You come into a low, dark foyer at the back, and you keep turning up these steps with a glimpse of some light beyond. And then you arrive, and this is where you arrive from coming through this dark foyer. And it was the same thing in Unity Temple. And you arrive here, and the sensation is all the more exciting because you were just in this dark, compressed space. This experience is called compression and release. And the entire front facade is French doors with art glass opening onto a terrace here. And it's just brilliantly designed. If you were sitting, unfortunately all the furniture's gone, but if you were sitting in the living room, this is a very busy street in Chicago. And you would look out and you would just see trees because the wall of the terrace is just high enough that you see above it. All of the street is obscured. So you feel like you're in the country. He thought of every detail. And the ceiling is beautifully articulated with oak beams and these spherical light fixtures. And the changes in height add interest. So again, part of breaking the box. The floors are different materials. You often will step down to a lower level. The walls are part glass, part brick, part stone. And then, where's the wall end and the ceiling begins? You have these beams. You have changes in height. The ambiguity. Are you in the if you're standing here, are you in the living room or the dining room beyond? So there's this wonderful ambiguity, and your experience of the space is always changing. No matter where you are, you're sort of looking toward the dining room, you're looking out, you're looking, maybe you're on the terrace, you're in a closed garden. I mean, the ways of experiencing the property is really something. So Wright sought to express the essence of materials. In the Japanese Shinto religion, one would be discouraging from varnishing a wood post because the post is radiating the spirit of the wood into the space. And Wright would wax or stain wood, but he never painted it. He also never used wallpaper, and there's very little plaster in his work. So one disadvantage, if you have a Wright home, there's very, very little wall space to hang things. And even if you found a way, if he would come by and he'd take it off. But for whatever reason, there's all these built-in shelves everywhere. So if you collected pottery, there's or sculpture, there's tons of places, but there's no place to hang anything on the walls. A subsequent owner of the Roby House, the Chicago Theological Seminary, announced plans in 1957 to demolish the house for a dormitory. There was an international outcry, and Wright, then 90 years old, returned to the Roby House with the media in tow. He quipped, "It all goes to show the danger of entrusting anything spiritual to the clergy." And shortly after, the city of Chicago formed a landmarks commission and declared the structure a landmark. And it's now owned by the city of Chicago. So some of Wright's most celebrated designs are his stained and art glass. And the difference is stained glass has color and art glass is usually just clear glass with patterns in it. But for some reason, around this time, after the Roby House, he stopped designing. He did relatively little art glass, he did some, but much less. And I don't know whether it was a change in fashion. People couldn't afford it. But it's a shame. But one of the things he's most celebrated for is his art glass. Just gorgeous. And I just threw together a bunch of designs. I mean, you could Google him. I mean, it's just endless. the stained glass, his light fixtures, the textile block, a fixture on the inside. This is furniture. Anyone know where this furniture was designed for? One of his office buildings? Very good, yes.
What did he say?
Johnson Wax. Abstract design. This teapot, no, you won't know where that was designed. He designed china for the Imperial Hotel in Japan. This is a graphic design. This is a carpet, a light fixture, a spire on churches, stained glass, a carpet, a gate at all. I mean, it's just insane. He designed everything. And it's all unique, and it's just all... Mema. Wright was known to be a ladies' man, audaciously going automobiling around Oak Park with married women in his custom-made sports roadster. He usually contented himself with flirtations, but then there was Mema. In 1903, Wright designed a house for Edwin and Martha Borthwick Cheney, known as Mema, and their 2 children. And I won't give you a picture of it because it's one of his dullest buildings. At any rate, in spite of that, she fell in love with him, even though he gave her a so-so house. Mema was not a typical suburban housewife. She was an early feminist, she was artistic and spirited, and she was Wright's intellectual equal. In 1909, after the Roby House, Frank Lloyd Wright lamented that he had done all he could with the prairie style. And in 1909, he was born in 1867, so he was 42. He wrote, "This absorbing, consuming phase of my experience as an architect ended. I had almost reached my 40th year." What's up with my math there? "Weary, I was losing grip on my work. I could see no way out." Wright said that he had experienced the feeling of fatherhood for his buildings, but never for his children. He said he hated the sound of the word papa. How sad. He said he never loved his wife Catherine as she deserved. He asked her for a divorce, but she refused. A German publisher, Ernst Wasmuth, offered to work with Wright on a monograph of his projects. And in the fall of 1909, with no warning, he closed his studio, left his wife and children, and fled to Europe with Mema. They spent part of their time at a love nest in Fiesole outside of Florence. And this is a Wasmuth publication. And has anyone read the book Loving Frank? It's really good. It's a historical novel about his relationship with Mema. Wright's actions outraged, stayed Oak Park, and he and Mema were not well received when they returned to America in 1911. Business suffered as few clients were willing to publicly associate with him. Wright's mother, Anna, acquired a few hundred acres of land near relatives in Spring Green, Wisconsin. She gave the property to Frank to help him start a new life. He built a house and complex that he named Taliesin, after a legendary 6th century Welsh bard. Anyone know what Taliesin means in Welsh?
Shining brow.
What? Shining brow. That's very good. And that was also, people thought it may have resonated with him because when Wright was a baby, they said that he had a big forehead, and they sort of referred to that as a shining brow.
Is the picture on the top, the other side of the building?
Yeah, so this is kind of in the courtyard, I think, and that's another side, and this is what's known as the Crow's Nest. That was his private balcony. And this is Romeo and Juliet. It's a windmill he did many years earlier. It's a wonderful little structure, like a folly that he had done. And his uncles, his mother was one of 10 kids, so he had 5 uncles and 4 aunts. And his uncles always, complained about it and said it's going to blow over in the next storm. But it never did. Wright was a great engineer. Although some of his cantilevers did lean. And all of his roofs leaked, but nobody's perfect. Shining brow in Welsh, Taliesin means shining brow, which was fitting for Wright, who declared, "No house should ever be on a hill. It should be of the hill, belonging to it. Hill and house should live together, each the happier for the other." The still married Wright, now divorced Mema, and his mother Anna moved in, and he was now a favorite topic of the scandal-mongering press. But here in his native valley of Spring Green, Wright created a world devoted to architecture, art, music, and architecture. He loved Beethoven, by the way. Plus, Wright was a pretty good pianist. He had to have a grand piano everywhere. Evidently, in his two Taliesin's, here in Taliesin West and Phoenix, he had like 15 grand pianos between the two properties. And he could not afford it, but he got them. He bought them. He bought them on credit, and then he'd find a way to finagle out of paying, because he couldn't afford 15 grand pianos. But this was his own Monticello, his sanctuary of truth against the world. Taliesin comprised a studio and office with living quarters for draftsmen, workers, and farmers, barns, a granary, and stables. And the house is built of gold and yellow limestone from nearby quarries, plaster made with sand from the Wisconsin River, and cypress. Wright wrote, "The whole was low, wide, and snug, a broad shelter seeking fellowship with its surroundings." And commissions started to return, and things were looking up. He actually had two in the teens after his hegira with Mema. In the teens, he actually was very busy. He spent 10 years working on the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. Just an extraordinary building that unfortunately was demolished, I think, in the 40s. And he worked on this amazing place, this pleasure gardens in Chicago called Midway Gardens, that was like a huge outdoor beer palace. But it fell into disuse with World War I. People weren't drinking beer. They didn't like the German connection. And that was demolished, unfortunately, years later. But on August 14th, 1914, while Wright was away on a project in Chicago, an unimaginable horror occurred. He received a phone call, Taliesin destroyed by fire. But there was much worse news to come. Does anybody know about this incident? Wright had recently hired a couple from Barbados, Julian Carleton and his wife, to serve as butler and cook at Taliesin. For unknown reasons on that day, Carleton went mad. He served the meal in his dress whites as usual, and then proceeded to lock all of the doors at Taliesin except one. He set the house on fire, and as people rushed out, he bludgeoned them with an axe. 7 people died, including Mema, her 2 children, and 4 workmen. Carleton was later found hiding in the boiler room. He had attempted suicide before he was captured by swallowing hydrochloric acid. His throat was so badly burned that he could not eat. He died in jail a month later of starvation, and he never gave an explanation for the attack. The events at Taliesin shared headlines with the outbreak of World War I in Europe, and reportedly, Wright briefly considered taking his own life. But that was not his nature. He began rebuilding Taliesin a month later. Has anyone been to Hollyhock House? One person has. So after this, Wright started to do work outside of the Midwest. He pursued projects in Los Angeles, where his son Lloyd was working as an architect. It was a place to escape and heal, and he also hoped to find more progressive clients in Los Angeles who would be receptive to his designs. This is the Hollyhock House. And between 1917 and 1924, Wright designed 5 houses in California. This was the first for oil heiress Aline Barnsdall, showcasing her favorite flower. And just wonderful. I mean, the hollyhock everywhere, on this carpet, on these piers, the backs of the chairs. And Aline Barnsdall, I look forward to going out to Hollyhock House for a tour sometime, but she was an oil heiress, and she was really eccentric, and she was a handful. And evidently she was as difficult as Wright. And they had a tempestuous relationship. But he built her this beautiful house. But evidently, she lived in it only a brief period of time. And she complained, the front entrance was that the door was made of concrete. And it was great. It was really cool, but she couldn't move it. So I think she only lived there a very brief period of time.
No kidding.
But it's open to the public. It's owned by Los Angeles County. Wright then pioneered a method for unifying structure and ornament that was entirely different from his earlier work. He mused, the concrete block, the cheapest and ugliest thing in the building world. It lived mostly in the architectural gutter as an imitation of rock-faced stone. Why not see what could be done with that gutter rat? We would take that despised outcast out from underfoot, find a hitherto unsuspected soul in it, make it live as a thing of beauty. So thin blocks molded on site could be plain, decorated, perforated, or filled with glass inserts. And they would have channels on them. I mean, it was just an ingenious design. They would have these channels, these metal rods, horizontal and vertical, to fit around them, and they would be 2 withes wide. Who knows what a withe is? W-Y-T-H-E. A withe is like a construction wall. So he'd have 2, an interior and an exterior wall of these textile blocks. And then they'd be filled with grout. And he thought this was like going to be a cheap thing. We can like mass produce this and build cheap houses for people. Well, how could this possibly be cheap? It was very, very complex. With a lot of hands-on work, they molded the blocks on site. I mean, just a huge, complex thing, but brilliant. But he likened the walls to weaving, and he called them textile blocks. And his first textile block house, although it didn't actually use the bars, was called La Miniatura. And Wright came up with names for lots of his houses. And he called it La Miniatura because it's, well, relatively small, but it's actually not that small a house. And it's evocative of a pre-Columbian ruin. And he described the house as a small gem dropped into a magical forest. The client, Alice Millard, carried on the business of her deceased husband, who had been a dealer in rare books. And Wright sold her on the idea, he said every design comes from the site. Just spontaneously, I'm inspired by the site. And, that was some BS. He wanted to build these textile blocks. He came up with the idea, so he, persuaded his client. He says, these will be fireproof for your books. But like many of Wright's, and there's other things like Price Towers. Anyone heard Price Tower in Bartlesville? It's a high-rise in this little town. And he had a design for a high-rise in New York City decades earlier that wasn't built. And he always had the design sitting around. So he persuaded his client in Bartlesville to build it. His client, Harold Price, he manufactured utility pipes or something. He said, I wanted a 2-story building. Wright wanted a 10-story building, so we compromised at 19 stories. It's typical of Wright. So shortly after Maima's death, Wright received a sympathy letter from a woman named Miriam Knoll. She said she was an artist and she had also suffered great loss. She was wealthy and cultured and infatuated with Wright, who she called Lord of my waking dreams. She was also violent, unstable, and addicted to morphine. A real charmer. And he knew it. He knew she was a huge problem before they married. And finally, Kitty granted him a divorce, and he married her in 1923. And he knew she was a problem, but he thought maybe marrying her would tame her. But she was to cause him untold distress. Soon after the marriage, she left him for another man, but she continued to harass him for years with threats and lawsuits. Olgivanna. Has anyone heard of Olgivanna? In 1924, while separated from Miriam Knoll, Wright met a captivating woman at a performance of the Russian ballet in Chicago. And she actually was sitting next to him. And he said to her about the ballet, he was sort of attracted to her. And he muttered to her, "Don't the dancers look dead?" And that really caught her, as you'll see in a moment. And she said, "I knew right then he was the one." Because he said, "Don't they look dead?" But so Olga Ivanovna Milyanov-Lazovich Hinzenberg was born in Montenegro and educated in Tsarist Russia. Wright called her Olgivanna. She was a dancer and a disciple of George Gurdjieff. Has anyone heard of Gurdjieff? That's because you look like him. On a great day. On a great day. George Gurdjieff was a mystic and spiritual leader who ran his Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man in Fontainebleau outside of Paris. And Olga Ivana was dark, aristocratic, and mysterious. She was 26, and he was 57. Olga Ivana moved into Taliesin with her daughter Svetlana, and soon they had a baby together, Ivana. He was still married to Miriam Knoll, and a new scandal arose. In 1926, Wright was arrested in Minneapolis under the notorious Mann Act for transporting a woman across state lines for immoral purposes, and he spent a night or two in jail. The next year, there was another fire at Taliesin. It was an electrical fire. Wright fell into debt, and the bank seized the property. He had to sell his treasured Japanese print collection and beg help from friends to avoid losing his home. Wright and Knoll finally divorced in 1928, and he married Olga Ivana. The third time was the charm. She was his equal, providing him the stability and support that he needed, and she was also a remarkable woman in her own right. And they remained together the rest of his life. Over a 10-year period, from 1924 to 1934, Wright had very few commissions due to his still dodgy reputation, the Depression starting in 1929, his travails with Miriam Knoll, and a new architectural wave that seemed to leave him behind. The modernist movement started before World War I and gained supremacy by the 1930s. Architects who did not embrace this new thesis were considered reactionary. The Europeans, Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, and Mies van der Rohe were the new stars. Though arguably many of their principles started with Wright, and a number of them had moved to America after the rise of Hitler in Europe. The modernists rejected tradition and historical styles like Wright, heralding a sleek, minimalist, high-tech architecture. Gropius proclaimed, "We must start from zero." Mies intoned, "Less is more." Le Corbusier called the house a machine for living, and Adolf Loos infamously decreed ornament is crime. Louis Sullivan's form ever follows function, not form follows function. He said form ever follows function was invoked, though Louis Sullivan was hardly a modernist. And here's Mies' much acclaimed Barcelona Pavilion. Modernists love it. And here is his really exquisite glass house, Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois. Has anyone ever seen the Farnsworth House? Has anyone seen Philip Johnson's glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut? Really beautiful place. And an interesting contrast with Mies' glass house. While some of Wright's work is consistent with modernist tenets, he was a singular artist and a romantic, and he rejected the movement's rigid doctrine. Wright appreciated the new materials, concrete, metal, and glass, but he also admired the qualities of wood, brick, and stone, and found inspiration above all in nature, as well as technology. He believed that design should arise from the character of the site, and not in an international style supposedly suitable for all places. The international style was like, this is it, this is appropriate everywhere. I don't think so. Mies believed that structure, proportion, and scale provided all the necessary aesthetic values. Wright referred to the modernists as the glass box boys, and he decried their buildings as soulless. Architect Philip Johnson, co-curator of the Museum of Modern Art's groundbreaking 1932 exhibition on the international style, belittled Wright, most inaccurately as the greatest architect of the 19th century. So Philip Johnson was kind of the dean of modernist architecture, and he was quite the wit himself. And he and Wright knew each other, and they kind of gave it to each other. Wright did not appreciate his comment. And Wright once visited the Glass House, visited Johnson at the Glass House in New Canaan. And he teased Johnson. He said, inside he says, "Philip, am I supposed to wear a hat or not?" So I wish I could have been there. Johnson also said about Wright, trying to find the genius of a man like that you realize is a genius when you are talking to him, and more of a genius as you get to know his work, is one of those things that probably doesn't go into words. I hated him, of course, but that's only normal when a man is so great. Still, Wright was considered passé. Here's Mies Seagram's building in New York from much later, 1958. Gropius's building in Lincoln, Mass. on the bottom. And I don't think Gropius was not much of an architect. He was not very prolific, and his buildings are not particularly good. He was more of a polemic and a teacher. He ran the Harvard School of Design for years. And Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy outside of Paris from 1928. Le Corbusier, these were the stars, but Le Corbusier was a villain. He was a rotten guy, and Wright hated him. Le Corbusier, that's my opinion. Le Corbusier proposed, he had a plan called Plan Voisin to demolish much of the heart of Paris and had put high-rise towers up there. He thought that was a good thing. And these ideas led to, things like Co-op City and the destruction of a lot of our cities in the 1960s, these kind of ideas. Wright's apprentices told of an amusing ritual of the time. A fly would appear in the drafting room, and Wright would christen the bug Gropius, Mies, or Le Corbusier, and then violently swat it. Ogivana encouraged her husband to give lectures and to write his autobiography, especially when work was slow. But her most brilliant scheme was the creation of the Taliesin Fellowship in 1932, modeled in part on Gurdjieff's Institute. There was an annual fee of $650, and apprentices would be expected to do 4 hours of physical labor a day. They would be providing living quarters, meals, exposure to dance, music, and poetry, and the opportunity to assist on projects. But there would be no conventional architectural instruction. Brendan Gill says, "The difficulty of living beyond one's means had been erased. A small army of robust young folk would serve him night and day, paying him a considerable sum for the privilege of being in his presence. He made no pretext of being a teacher. Rather, he was an example. They could hold his colored pencils for him. They could watch him fiddle with his T-square, and they could turn his graphic musings into hundreds of pages of working drawings." Jenkin Lloyd Jones, a cousin of Wright, recalled the early years of the fellowship. "I shamefully underestimated the magic of Frank and Ogivana. In spite of gross exploitation, the laborers gathered worshipfully around their two gurus. Here was Plato, here was Joan of Arc, no matter that Frank was far overdue on payments for his front-wheel cord-drive automobile. There was a spurious opulence in the midst of near starvation. Bittersweet and pussy willows, gathered in the bog, adorned the living room. There may have been nothing on the table but soup and dark brown bread, but Ogivana would trot out a jar of Montenegrin plum jam, and we all feasted." Wright once explained to a visitor, "We're very democratic here. When I'm hungry, everybody eats." And Gurdjieff himself visited Taliesin in 1935. And I would love to have seen those two rascals together. Evidently, they got on very well. And apprentices at the time remember eating little but cabbages and potatoes, and a particularly vile sauerkraut that Gurdjieff devised. And when he departed, he left barrels of the stuff, which they unceremoniously dumped out. Okay. Ken Burns said in his profile, Frank Lloyd Wright was 62 in 1929, and his long, turbulent career seemed at an end. Wealthy clients no longer knocked at his studio door. Younger architects dismissed him as a has-been, and his private life remained tainted by scandal. But at Taliesin, the once magnificent home he had built for himself, he stubbornly refused to admit defeat. Some of his greatest buildings were still to come. Now, it was Wright's practice often to think through a design very, very carefully before putting anything on paper. So, if you know the punchline here, don't say it. In 1934, a wealthy department store owner commissioned Wright to design a country house. Wright visited the site and wrote, "The visit in the woods stays with me, and a domicile has taken vague shape in my mind to the music of the stream. When contours come, you will see it." To the client's distress, many months went by, and he heard nothing from Wright. The client had a business trip to the Midwest and told Wright that he would like to stop in and see the plans. The next day, he called Wright from Milwaukee, which is just a few hours from Taliesin. According to Edgar Toffel, an apprentice, Wright boomed into the phone, "Come along, EJ, we're ready for you." Toffel was aghast, as Wright had not drawn a single line. And now the client is driving there from Milwaukee. Toffel describes the scene. Wright hung up the phone, sat down at the table, and began to draw. First floor plan, second floor, building section, elevation, sketches of details, talking to himself the whole time. Here is the balcony. Here is a bridge so EJ and Lillian can walk out and have a picnic. The design just poured out of him, pencils being used up as fast as the apprentices could sharpen them. Then the title across the bottom, Falling Water. Edgar Kaufman arrived just before noon. As he walked up the steps, he was greeted by the master. "Welcome, EJ. We have been waiting for you." Wright, the dreamer and visionary at his best, and the basic design never changed from that point. Brendan Gill said, "One comes upon Falling Water as upon some gorgeous apparition, asserting the implausibility of its steel and concrete presence in a fold of the ancient Appalachians. It is a feat of architecture that prompts in a visitor approaching it for the first time a temptation to applaud." Probably his greatest building. And just you go down those steps and you can sit by the water, and some interior shots. And this was obviously not the project the Kaufmans expected. But Wright said, "EJ, I want you to live with the waterfall, not just look at it." There was a large boulder. This was a boulder that on a cliff overhanging the waterfall where Kaufman liked to sunbathe. And now that boulder is inside the house, right in front of the hearth. And there's water. You can't see it here, but he's got a little pool. There's a pool there. A number of his buildings, he has a hearth. And he has a water feature, and water flows through. And then he's got a skylight and art glass. So you have earth, wind or air, fire, and water. Speaking of heroic buildings, the Fountainhead inspired countless impressionable young people, including me, to apply to architecture school. The Titan, architect Howard Rourke, is widely assumed to be modeled on Wright, who himself once did say, "Individuality is sacred." But Rand and Wright both denied it. But obviously, Howard Rourke was based on Frank Lloyd Wright. Rourke is a fiery genius embattled by the establishment who blows up his masterpiece rather than see it compromised by minor and really minor design changes. Howard Rourke did some other unseemly things too, much worse than anything Wright ever did. Wright and Rand met a few times, and evidently they had a mutual antipathy. She wanted to interview him when writing the novel, but he refused. She actually commissioned a house from him that was quite handsome, but she didn't build it for one reason or another. And the producer of the third-rate movie starring Gary Cooper asked Wright to provide drawings for the film, but allegedly he asked for too much money. Starting in the 1930s, Wright sought ways to build a simpler house that would be affordable for the middle class. He called this a Usonian house. This is the Zimmerman House in Manchester, a later example from around 1950. It's small and single-story. The garage is eliminated in place of a carport. Clear-story windows are used for privacy. Those are higher windows. You can't see directly out. And the front facade, this is one of his least alluring of all of his designs, our building in Manchester. It's also turned at an odd angle to the street, which is not very inviting. Wright was not much of an urbanist. He was not that concerned with urban context. He was concerned about the interior and the outside private space for his clients. But again, the interior was something else. Like other Usonian houses, it's built on a concrete slab with radiant heat, which he invented, that serves as the finished floor. The walls are wood. They're usually cypress or redwood. The small living room is multifunctional. There's built-in seating, tables, bookshelves, cabinets, and lighting. There's a separate wing from the core with small, snug bedrooms. And the Zimmermans were musicians like Wright. He designed this cool music stand for them. They both loved chamber music. And Mrs. Zimmerman said, "We never refused to show anyone our house. We often served lunch or dinner to the occasional Frank Lloyd Wright fans who came by, and in some instances we invited them to spend the night in our guest room. Twice each year on Wright's birthday, June 8th, and at Christmas, the Zimmermans sent their architect Vermont maple syrup, and they continue this ritual to his death. They did not have any children, and they donated their wonderful house to the Currier Art Gallery. And you can go see it just an hour away." Here are some religious buildings by Wright. The interesting thing is, all of his houses are unique. Although on the inside there's a similar character, this rich wood, autumnal feel, even though everyone is unique. But they're at least the interior, there is a sort of a form. But his non-residential buildings, they're all different. It's just extraordinary. So these are his main churches. Ann Pfeiffer Chapel at Florida Southern, First Christian Church in Phoenix. Does anyone know what this building is? What? It's a synagogue. Yeah, this is a Beth Shalom Synagogue in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. This is the Unitarian Meeting House, not the Unitarian Temple in Madison. But these are supposed to be like praying hands. And this is Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, outside of Milwaukee. So, the Guggenheim is probably the best known of his work, along with Falling Water. It was also one of his most difficult projects, taking 16 years to complete. He had a lot of fights about this thing, and a lot of the artists, there was a petition signed by a number of modern artists. They didn't, they protesting the design. They didn't want to hang their buildings on a curve. It's curved, it's sloped, it leaned back, and they didn't like that the building would compete with their designs. And there's still different opinions if it's good for art. The New York City Building Department would not issue a building permit, which was nothing new to Wright, who often worked without a building permit. Often. Is unbelievable. And he just figured, whatever, let him come after me. And does anyone ever know the story of Johnson Wax? Do you know the story of the lily pad columns? And no. I should have included the picture. With Johnson Wax, another one of his really great buildings, the interior is like a cathedral. It has these wonderful lily pad columns that rise into a lily pad. And the building department would not accept it, that they were not strong enough, because they tapered to pretty small at the bottom. And he did this exhibit, he had the lily pad, one of these built on a field, and everybody was there, the press, the building department, all of his minions, and they had a crane and they kept on lowering these sacks, sandbags on top of it. And it had to carry something like 6 tons. And when it finally got to 20 tons, it collapsed. So Wright had the last laugh. But he was always doing those kinds of stunts. What?
The roof leaked.
It still leaked. But another thing about Wright, there were engineering problems with some of his buildings, but anybody who is as daring as him, you are going to have problems. The Johnson Wax building, in between the columns, he used these new plastic Pyrex tubing, which created this wonderful feeling of the translucent light. It had never been used before. It leaked, but he was pushing. He was daring, and you're going to have that. And it's a small, nothing price to pay. There's a great story. Tim and I was just talking about this before. One of his buildings, a great building, Wingspread. I don't think it was Tim. I think you said Roby House, but it was Wingspread. This wonderful building that he designed for the owner of Johnson Wax. Once called him at Thanksgiving. He said, "Frank, I've got 8 people here for Thanksgiving, and the roof is leaking right at the table." At Thanksgiving, you know what Wright said? He said, "Harold moved the table." No, not Harold. I forget. It was him moved the table. Another time, someone complained about the roof leaking. He said, "That's how you know it's a roof." So anyway, the New York City Building Department would not issue a building permit, and Wright appealed to Robert Moses, who was a distant cousin of him, even though Moses hated Wright. But Robert Moses, New York czar of development, who thundered, "I do not care how many laws have to be broken, the building permits will be issued." And of course they were. Ada Louise Huxtable said, "This soaring volume with its encircling ramps is an intensely moving experience. The impact is visual and visceral. The building is alive. The movement of people and their murmurous sound, the surrounding color and form, redefine social space and the way art is seen and felt." The Guggenheim was the culmination of Wright's lifelong aim to open up space. He said of his museum, "Here for the first time architecture appears plastic, one floor flowing into the next. The net result is a greater repose, the atmosphere of the quiet, unbroken wave. All is one." The Guggenheim opened 6 months after Wright's death. Frank Lloyd Wright died on April 9th, 1959, after an operation for an intestinal blockage. He was 91. Seeing him laid out, his son Lloyd said this was the first time he realized how physically small his father was. Wright was like 5'6½". He's my height. Nobody ever thought of him as being small. But he evidently had a complex about it. And that's one of the reasons the ceilings were so low. It's like, it fits me. You don't like it? Upon his death, Mies van der Rohe saluted Wright. In his undiminished power, he resembles a giant tree in a wide landscape, which year after year attains a more noble crown. And as much as Wright really resented the modernists, he hated Le Corbusier, and he did not like Gropius, but he respected Mies. He thought Mies was pretty cool. He spent a lot of time giving Mies a tour of Taliesin and other sites. And Mies was German, and all Mies had to say was, "Ja." He was a man of few words, but he was a great architect. So Frank Lloyd Wright's creativity was just endless. He claimed, this is a great line, he claimed that he could simply shake the designs out of his sleeve. And I believe it. As he grew older, he continued to conjure a rich assortment of fantastic structures. Here are some buildings that were never constructed for one reason or another. For many of his clients, their relationship with Wright proved the most rewarding, or at least the most memorable experience of their entire lives. Of the small number who claimed to be sorry that they ever had anything to do with Wright, Brendan Gill tells about an old woman he interviewed who spoke with indignation of Wright's efforts to persuade her to build a musical theater when all she wanted was a simple music room. Gill says, "As I stood listening to her, she seemed to shed 20 years. Her eyes sparkled, blood rushed into her cheeks, and her voice regained the vehement firmness of long disappeared middle age." One apprentice said, "Wright could make you feel like a moron. he could also make you feel like the chosen companion of God. There are few experiences in architecture more rewarding than visiting a building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. There's a magic about Wright, both of the man and of his work. And that is what we seek, isn't it? To find some magic in our lives. Brendan Gill says, "It is another Wright that flourishes today, far beyond the boundaries of his life and time. Admiration of his handiwork approaches the universal. Who complains any longer that his roofs leak, that his chairs draw blood, that he never used to pay his bills? Old scamp, old teller of lies, old maker of wonders, how do you manage to go on performing this feat of hypnotism upon us? For it is the case that we are all more or less continuously under your spell." Thank you.